December 15th, 1944. The Vosges Mountains of eastern France stood wrapped in heavy fog that morning, their pine-covered slopes holding secrets that would reshape how the American military viewed both improvisation and the soldiers they had long underestimated. The temperature hovered just above freezing, creating conditions where moisture hung suspended in the air, turning the forest into a realm of limited visibility and muffled sound. In a frozen observation post overlooking a strategic valley near the village of Sainte-Marie-aux-Mines, Staff Sergeant James Monroe of the 92nd Infantry Division adjusted a rifle scope that shouldn't have worked at all according to any reasonable engineering standard. The lens assembly had cracked 3 days earlier during a particularly rough transport incident, rendering the expensive optical equipment essentially worthless by any standard military assessment. Yet Monroe had spent his last evening's rest period when most soldiers tried to grab whatever sleep their circumstances permitted, carefully inserting a 75-cent reading glass lens from a village pharmacy into the damaged housing, securing it with friction tape and an almost embarrassing amount of hope based more on desperation than confidence. His commanding officer, Captain Michael Richardson, had laughed when he first saw the improvised repair, though his laughter carried more affection than mockery. Richardson had suggested Monroe request a replacement through proper channels, instead of playing inventor with equipment that cost the government more than most soldiers earned in a month. The captain had even helped Monroe fill out the requisition paperwork. Though both men understood that equipment requests for the 92nd Infantry Division moved through the supply chain with a speed that suggested the forms were being filed rather than processed. What no one in that command post could have predicted that morning, as Monroe settled into position with his improbable repair job, was that this makeshift modification would prove more effective at extreme range than the original factory scope had been, and that over the next 6 weeks, this improvised optical system would contribute to a fundamental shift in how the American military understood both field innovation and the capabilities of soldiers they had systematically marginalized for reasons having nothing to do with competence. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how necessity, ingenuity, and overlooked talent converged in the winter forests of France, where a black soldier's refused-to-quit attitude and a 75-cent piece of glass would challenge assumptions about both equipment and the men who used it. It's a story about how innovation often emerges from constraint rather than abundance, how talent persists regardless of institutional recognition, and how the smallest modifications can sometimes reveal truths that entire bureaucracies have worked to obscure. Staff Sergeant James Monroe had learned patience long before the Army taught him marksmanship, though the military would later try to claim credit for skills he had developed over years of necessity. Growing up in rural Georgia during the Depression, he had spent countless hours hunting to feed his family, learning to read wind and terrain with the kind of attention that comes from knowing your family's dinner depends on not wasting ammunition. In an era when a box of rifle cartridges represented a significant portion of the family budget, Monroe had learned to make every shot count, to wait for the perfect moment rather than hoping volume would compensate for imprecision. His father, Samuel Monroe, had been a sharecropper who supplemented their meager income with occasional work as a hunting guide for wealthy visitors from Atlanta and further north. Men who came to Georgia's woods seeking the kind of authentic outdoor experience that their urban lives lacked. Young James had accompanied his father on these guiding trips from the time he was old enough to walk quietly through the forest, learning not just how to shoot, but how to read landscape in ways that made shooting almost secondary. His father had taught him to notice how wind moved through different types of vegetation, how temperature affected air density, and thus bullet trajectory, how time of day changed the way animals moved and fed. These weren't lessons taught through formal instruction, but through patient demonstration and gentle correction, the kind of education that sinks deep because it comes from lived experience rather than abstract theory. By the time Monroe was 14, he was regularly outshot his father and most of the clients they guided, a fact that Samuel Monroe acknowledged with pride, even as he quietly warned his son about the dangers of showing up white men, especially wealthy white men who came south expecting to demonstrate their superiority. It was a lesson in reading social terrain as carefully as physical landscape, understanding that in Georgia during the Depression, a young black man's survival often depended on managing other people's egos as much as on any practical skill. Monroe learned to miss occasionally on purpose, to defer credit, to make his competence seem accidental rather than cultivated. It was training that would serve him well in the Army, though not in ways he would have chosen. When Monroe enlisted in 1942, just months after Pearl Harbor brought America fully into the war, he had hoped that military service might offer opportunities beyond what Georgia's segregated society permitted. He had heard rumors that the war was changing things, that the military needed men and couldn't afford to be as choosy about race as civilian society had been. It was a hope shared by thousands of black men who saw the war as a potential catalyst for change, who believed that serving their country might earn recognition and rights that had been systematically denied. Instead, Monroe found himself assigned to the 92nd Infantry Division, one of only 2 black combat divisions in the entire American military structure, a unit that existed more to contain black soldiers in segregated spaces than to utilize their capabilities effectively. The 92nd had originally been formed during World War I, when the Army reluctantly agreed to create black combat units in response to political pressure from black leaders and white progressives who argued that denying black men the chance to fight for their country was both morally indefensible and practically wasteful. The division had a complicated history, having served in Italy during the First World War with a record that was subsequently debated and distorted by officers whose racial prejudices colored their assessment of the unit's performance. By World War II, the division's reformation was viewed by many in the military establishment as an unfortunate political necessity, rather than a genuine commitment to integrated or even equal service. The Army's leadership largely viewed these segregated black units as experiments at best, expecting little and providing even less. Equipment shortages were routine and often seemed deliberate rather than accidental, with the 92nd consistently receiving older weapons, worn uniforms, and unreliable vehicles that had been judged unfit for white units. Training time was limited compared to white divisions, and the underlying assumption from senior commanders was that these soldiers would primarily serve in support roles rather than frontline combat, regardless of what their official designation suggested. The officers assigned to command black units were themselves a mixed group, ranging from idealistic young men who specifically requested the assignment because they opposed segregation, to older officers whose careers had stalled and who viewed a black division as their last chance for advancement, to outright racists who saw the position as an opportunity to confirm their prejudices about racial inferiority. Monroe's path to becoming a designated marksman had been almost accidental, the kind of fortunate recognition that happened rarely enough to seem remarkable when it occurred. During a routine training exercise at Fort Huachuca in Arizona, where the 92nd had been stationed for preparation before overseas deployment, Monroe had consistently outshot everyone in his company, including the white instructors who had been brought in to evaluate the division's readiness and, many suspected, to document its inadequacy. His groupings at 600 yards were tight enough that the range officer initially suspected the targets had been marked incorrectly or that someone had switched them to embarrass the evaluators. After confirming the results through multiple repetitions, watching Monroe shoot under direct observation to eliminate any possibility of deception, the officer had made a note in Monroe's file, but seemed genuinely uncertain what to do with a black soldier who showed such exceptional skill in a role traditionally reserved for specialists drawn from the military's most elite units. The range officer's confusion was rooted in the military's institutional assumptions about race and capability. While the Army officially claimed that black soldiers received the same training and opportunities as white soldiers, the reality was a complex system of informal barriers and lowered expectations that ensured black soldiers rarely advanced into positions of technical skill or independent operation. Sniper assignments were particularly problematic because they required not just shooting skill but judgment, patience, and the ability to operate independently or in small teams with minimal supervision. These were exactly the qualities that racist military doctrine insisted black soldiers lacked, creating a contradiction when soldiers like Monroe demonstrated capabilities that doctrine claimed were impossible. It was Captain Michael Richardson, a white officer from Oregon, who had requested assignment to the 92nd, specifically because he believed the Army's racial policies were both morally wrong and tactically stupid, who ensured Monroe received proper sniper training instead of having his talent wasted in a standard rifle squad. Richardson had fought bureaucratic resistance for weeks to get Monroe a scoped rifle, proper training ammunition that wasn't worn out from multiple uses, and the specialized instruction that marksmen required to transition from being good shooters to being effective combat snipers. He had argued repeatedly in meetings and written reports that damaged his standing with senior officers, that refusing to use talented soldiers because of their race was like refusing to use functional equipment because of its color, an argument that had won few friends among his fellow officers, but had eventually worn down enough resistance to get Monroe the tools he needed to develop his skills properly. Richardson's motivation was complex, mixing genuine moral conviction with a pragmatic recognition that the war would be won or lost based on how effectively America used all its resources, human included. He had grown up in a relatively progressive community in the Pacific Northwest, where his parents had been involved in labor organizing and civil rights advocacy, giving him a framework for understanding systemic racism that most of his fellow officers lacked. When he graduated from West Point in 1939, he had already decided that if war came, he wanted to serve in ways that challenged rather than reinforced America's racial hierarchy. Requesting assignment to a black combat division had seemed like an opportunity to put principle into practice, though the reality of fighting institutional racism from within the military proved more exhausting and less effective than his youthful idealism had anticipated. By December 1944, Monroe had been operating in France for 3 months, arriving as part of the division's deployment to the European theater after extensive training, and more than a little skepticism from commanders who doubted the unit's combat effectiveness. The 92nd had been assigned to the relatively quiet sector in the Vosges Mountains, partly because command still doubted their combat capabilities, despite training results that suggested otherwise, and partly because the terrain's difficulty made it less strategically critical than other sectors where the main Allied advance was pushing toward Germany through more accessible routes. The German forces opposite them were similarly considered second tier by their own command, a mix of older soldiers who had been judged too aged for primary combat roles, recovered wounded who had been released from hospitals but weren't fully fit for intensive operations, and units pulled from the Eastern Front for rest and refit after brutal fighting against Soviet forces. What neither side fully appreciated at the time was how the mountainous, forested terrain actually favored patient, skilled marksmen over the mobile warfare that characterized other sectors. The narrow valleys offered limited avenues of approach. The abundant tree cover provided concealment for careful observation. Limited roads created predictable movement patterns, and countless natural observation points gave advantage to anyone who could shoot accurately at distance and had the discipline to wait for high-value targets, rather than engaging every enemy soldier who appeared. The Vosges sector, dismissed by many commanders as a backwater assignment, actually created ideal conditions for the kind of warfare where individual skill and patience could have disproportionate impact. Monroe's original scope had been a standard military issue manufactured by a contractor in Pennsylvania, a company that had existed primarily as a civilian sporting optics manufacturer before the war, and had expanded rapidly to meet military contracts. The scope was designed to provide reliable performance out to 800 yards under most environmental conditions, with specifications that balanced optical quality against durability and cost. The optical quality was adequate, but not exceptional, with some distortion at the edges of the field of view and a slight chromatic aberration, a color fringing effect that Monroe had learned to compensate for through experience. He had used it effectively for 3 months since arriving in France, recording 11 confirmed eliminations of high-value targets, a record that had started generating quiet notice even among officers predisposed to skepticism about black soldiers' combat effectiveness. The scope had cracked during transport when their convoy hit a crater-damaged road section with enough force to throw equipment violently around the truck bed. Monroe had been dozing against the truck's side when it happened, exhausted from a night patrol that had lasted until dawn, and he woke to the sound of equipment crashing and soldiers cursing as the truck bucked over the damaged roadway. When he collected himself enough to check his carefully maintained rifle case, his heart sank. The scope's objective lens housing showed a spiderweb crack across half its surface, the kind of damage that he knew would render the optical system essentially useless. Looking through it revealed a fractured, distorted view that made accurate shooting impossible beyond perhaps 100 yards, transforming his precision instrument into something only marginally better than iron sights. The proper procedure, according to military regulation and common sense, was to tag the scope as damaged combat equipment and request replacement through the supply chain. Captain Richardson had immediately submitted the necessary paperwork, filling out forms in triplicate and attaching Monroe's performance record to justify the urgency of the request. But both men knew from bitter experience that equipment requests for the 92nd moved slowly through a system that often seemed designed to ensure black units remained under-equipped compared to their white counterparts. Unofficial estimates, based on previous requisitions and conversations with supply personnel who were willing to speak honestly, suggested a replacement might arrive in 4 to 6 weeks, assuming it wasn't diverted to a white unit somewhere along the way, a practice that happened with sufficient regularity to seem like policy rather than accident. Monroe had stared at the broken scope that evening in the dim light of the dugout shelter, turning it over in his hands, studying the damage from multiple angles, thinking about the targets he wouldn't be able to engage, the opportunities he would miss. For a soldier whose entire combat role depended on precision optical equipment, being reduced to iron sights or borrowing someone else's rifle represented not just inconvenience but a fundamental loss of capability and purpose. The scope's internal lens array appeared intact when he examined it carefully, holding it up to catch what little light the shelter's lamp provided. It was just the front objective lens and its housing that had suffered damage. He found himself wondering if there was any way to bypass the damaged section, to create some kind of workaround that might at least let him operate effectively at medium range until the replacement arrived, whenever that might be. The idea initially seemed absurd even to Monroe himself. Military optical equipment was precision engineered, manufactured to exacting specifications in factories staffed by trained technicians using specialized tools and measurement equipment. The notion that he could repair such an instrument using whatever materials he might scrounge in a French village was the kind of desperate thinking that usually led nowhere except wasted time and dashed hopes. But desperation combined with enforced idleness had a way of making unlikely ideas seem worth attempting, and Monroe found himself unable to dismiss the possibility that some kind of improvised solution might exist. The village of Sainte-Marie-aux-Mines sat 2 miles behind their position along a winding mountain road, a small community that had changed hands twice during the fighting as German and Allied forces alternately advanced and withdrew through the Vosges sector. The village now found itself in the uncertain status of recently liberated, but not quite secure, its residents cautiously hopeful but aware that military fortunes could shift with little warning. Monroe had walked there the next afternoon during a quiet period when German activity was minimal and his absence from the observation post wouldn't compromise operations, hoping to find anything that might help with his seemingly impossible repair project. The village's small pharmacy was still operating despite the war's disruptions, run by an elderly woman named Madame Geraldine Arnaud, who had weathered German occupation with the same stern practicality she now applied to dealing with American soldiers. Her pharmacy had survived 4 years of occupation by being useful enough that German authorities left it alone, while being careful enough to avoid actions that might be construed as collaboration. She had filled prescriptions for occupiers while quietly providing medicine to resistance members, walking a careful line that had required constant judgment and no small amount of courage. Now, with Americans in the village, she continued her work with the same pragmatic approach, treating all her customers with professional courtesy while maintaining the emotional distance that survival had taught her. Monroe's French was limited to a few phrases learned from a pocket dictionary he had bought before shipping overseas, barely sufficient for basic politeness and utterly inadequate for technical discussions. But he had brought the broken scope with him to show what he needed, hoping that physical demonstration might overcome linguistic barriers. Madame Arnaud had examined the damaged scope with the careful attention of someone who had spent decades precisely filling prescriptions and measuring medications, her experienced hands turning it over, holding it up to the pharmacy's light, peering through it with one eye closed in professional assessment. She asked him questions in rapid French that he couldn't follow, her accent thick with regional dialect that would have challenged even a fluent speaker. Monroe could only shrug apologetically and repeat the few words he knew, trying to convey through gesture and tone that he needed something to replace the broken lens, but had no idea if such a thing was possible. Madame Arnaud studied him for a long moment, seeming to assess not just his request, but his character, perhaps deciding whether this tall black soldier with his polite desperation was worth helping. Whatever she concluded in that assessment, she nodded once and disappeared into the pharmacy's back room, leaving Monroe standing at the counter, wondering if he had somehow offended her or if she was actually searching for something useful. She returned several minutes later, carrying a wooden box that rattled with contents Monroe couldn't see. The box contained reading glasses, the simple magnifying lenses used by people whose eyes had aged past easy reading of fine print. There were perhaps 24 pairs in various strengths, some in wire frames, others in cheaper plastic, all well used and probably purchased from customers who had upgraded to stronger prescriptions or no longer needed them after death. Madame Arnaud held several up to the damaged scope, peering through different combinations, muttering assessments Monroe couldn't understand, but which seemed to involve both optical evaluation and probably some criticism of soldiers who broke expensive equipment. Finally, after trying perhaps 10 different lenses, she selected one with a simple wire frame and what appeared to be moderate magnification. She carefully removed one of its lenses by bending the frame slightly, a technique that suggested she had done this before for other purposes, and handed both the lens and the broken scope back to Monroe. She said something in French that might have been instructions or advice, or simply commentary on the peculiar things soldiers required. Monroe paid her 75 cents, which made Madame Arnaud smile for the first time during their interaction, a brief expression that suggested amusement at American soldiers buying reading glasses for rifles. She waved him out of the pharmacy with what seemed like good wishes, though Monroe couldn't be entirely certain. He returned to his position carrying what felt like either a solution or a waste of money and time, genuinely unsure which. The reading glass lens seemed impossibly simple compared to the precision-manufactured military optic it was supposed to somehow replace. The idea that it might actually work struck Monroe as unlikely at best, but having come this far in his improvised repair attempt, he felt committed to seeing if the notion had any merit whatsoever. That evening, Monroe worked by the uncertain light of a kerosene lamp in the dugout shelter that served as the snipers' quarters, a partially underground structure reinforced with logs and covered with earth that provided some protection from artillery fragments, while remaining cold and damp regardless of whatever heating measures the occupants attempted. His spotter, Corporal David Chen, a Chinese-American soldier from San Francisco who had his own complex and often painful relationship with the Army's racial hierarchies, watched with genuine interest as Monroe carefully removed what remained of the damaged objective lens assembly, using tools that were intended for weapons maintenance, but could be adapted with patience to optical work. Chen had grown up working in his family's optical goods store in San Francisco's Chinatown, a business that had served the neighborhood for 2 generations before the war. He had learned lens grinding and frame adjustment from his father and grandfather, developing skills that should have led to a career in the family business, but which had been interrupted by both the war and the broader upheaval in Chinese-American communities following Pearl Harbor. Though Chinese Americans weren't subject to the same internment that Japanese Americans faced, they still encountered suspicion, discrimination, and obstacles that made military service seem like both a patriotic duty and a possible path toward broader acceptance. Chen had ended up in the 92nd, not through any particular plan, but through the military's occasional bureaucratic confusion about racial categories, where his Asian features had somehow resulted in assignment to a black division, an error that no one bothered to correct once it was discovered. The reading glass lens was indeed smaller than the original housing, measuring perhaps 1 1/4 inches across, compared to the military scope's original 1.75-inch objective lens. But Monroe discovered through careful experimentation that if he positioned it forward in the tube, held in place with carefully applied layers of friction tape, that he wound with the precision of someone who understood that sloppy work would result in an optical system that shifted with every movement. It actually created a functional optical path that transmitted a surprisingly clear image from objective to eyepiece. The magnification wasn't quite right compared to the original design. The field of view was noticeably narrower, giving him less peripheral vision of the target area. And the eye relief, the distance his eye needed to be from the eyepiece for proper viewing, was different enough that he would need to adjust his shooting position slightly. But when he looked through the assembled scope, carefully focusing on objects at various distances within the dugout's confines, he could see a clear image without the distortion and fracturing that the crack had created. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't what any engineer would design intentionally, but it appeared to be functional in ways that seemed almost implausibly fortunate. Chen, applying knowledge from his years in his family's store, offered detailed suggestions about lens positioning and alignment, explaining concepts about focal length and optical axis that Monroe only partially understood, but appreciated nonetheless. Chen suggested they test the improvised scope on a makeshift range before trusting it in combat situations where mechanical failure or optical distortion could mean the difference between effective engagement and dangerous exposure. They spent the next morning, during a period when German activity was minimal and their absence from regular observation duties could be spared, shooting at targets Chen paced off at various distances, discovering through patient trial and adjustment that the modified scope actually performed remarkably well once Monroe learned to compensate for its slightly different characteristics. At 100 yards, the improvised scope produced groupings nearly identical to what Monroe had achieved with the original equipment, suggesting that at closer ranges, the modification introduced no significant errors. At 300 yards, where wind drift and shooter error became more significant factors, the performance remained solid, with Monroe placing shots within a 6-inch circle after accounting for the scope's characteristics. The real test came when they extended to 600 yards, the maximum distance their improvised range could accommodate given the terrain and safety considerations. Monroe fired 5 careful shots at a target Chen had constructed from scavenged materials, taking his time between each shot to ensure consistent position and breathing. When they walked down range to examine the results, both men were surprised to find that all 5 shots had struck within an 8-inch circle, performance that matched or slightly exceeded what Monroe had been achieving with the military scope before its damage. Whatever optical compromises the improvised modification involved, they apparently didn't significantly degrade his ability to place shots accurately at the ranges where most of his work occurred. What surprised them both even more was that at longer ranges, beyond 700 yards which they tested informally using landmarks they could observe from their position, the improvised scope seemed to produce a slightly clearer, more defined image than the original equipment had provided. Chen theorized, based on his understanding of optical principles learned in his family's store, that the reading lens's simpler single-element design actually reduced some of the chromatic aberration, the color fringing effect, that had affected the original military scope's more complex multi-element lens system. Military scopes were designed to balance multiple optical considerations, including field of view, magnification, and light gathering, sometimes accepting compromises in one area to improve others. The reading glass lens, designed only to magnify with reasonable clarity for close reading, apparently avoided some of those compromises in ways that happened to benefit long-range clarity. Whatever the optical physics involved, and neither Monroe nor Chen claimed to fully understand the technical principles at work, the practical result was that Monroe found himself able to distinguish details at extreme range more clearly than he had before the original scope's damage. He could pick out individual buttons on uniforms at 800 yards, could read unit insignia that had previously been barely visible, could distinguish facial features with a clarity that made target identification more certain. It was an unexpected benefit that transformed what had seemed like a desperate field repair into something that might actually improve his combat effectiveness. Captain Richardson's reaction when he saw the completed repair mixed amusement with reluctant admiration, wrapped in the kind of bemused disbelief that seemed appropriate for observing a 75-cent piece of glass somehow improving on precision military equipment. He examined the scope carefully, looked through it while Munro patiently explained the modifications, and listened to Chen's technical assessment, delivered with the confidence of someone who actually understood optical principles rather than just following procedures. Richardson made Munro promise to accept the replacement scope when it eventually arrived, emphasizing that he didn't want Munro court-martialed for destroying military property by removing it from service, but agreed that the improvised version could be used operationally until then. What Richardson later admitted in letters he wrote to his wife back in Oregon was that he had doubted the modification would hold up under actual field conditions. He had expected Munro to be requesting that replacement scope within days, reporting that the friction tape had loosened in the cold, or that the reading lens had cracked under the rifle's recoil, or that some other foreseeable failure had ended the experiment. The fact that Munro's improvised repair would not only hold up, but would exceed the original equipment's performance, was something Richardson hadn't allowed himself to believe possible. Despite his general respect for Munro's capabilities, the real operational test came 3 days later, on a morning when intelligence reports indicated increased German activity in the valley below their position. Supply convoys had been spotted moving through the area during the previous evening, and German officers had been conducting what appeared to be reconnaissance for a potential repositioning of their defensive lines in response to Allied pressure elsewhere in the sector. The intelligence suggested that morning observation might reveal high-value targets as officers conducted daylight assessments of positions that had been scouted during darkness. Munro and Chen moved into their primary observation post 2 hours before dawn, a carefully camouflaged position on a ridge that offered clear views across nearly a mile of valley terrain. The position had been prepared over several days, with natural vegetation supplemented by camouflage netting, and positioned so that the morning sun would be behind them, illuminating the valley while leaving their observation post in relative shadow. They carried enough food and water for an extended stay, along with spare ammunition, range cards they had prepared documenting distances to key landmarks, and the patience required for observation work where hours of watching might be rewarded with only minutes of actual engagement opportunity. The morning fog was heavy as it usually was in these mountains during winter, thick enough that visibility was measured in yards rather than miles, creating a grey world where sounds traveled strangely and spatial relationships became uncertain. Both men knew from experience that the fog would burn off by mid-morning as sunlight penetrated the valley, creating the brief window of clear visibility that made observation work possible in this terrain. Until then, they waited in the particular stillness that characterized professional soldiers during observation duties, conserving energy, staying alert but not tense, falling into the patient rhythm that their partnership had developed over months of working together. By 9 in the morning, the fog had begun thinning, initially just reducing from impenetrable grey to something where shapes became barely visible as darker suggestions within the murk. Chen scanned with binoculars that were themselves somewhat worn but still functional, moving his view slowly across the valley, searching for anything that suggested human activity. Munro stayed behind his rifle, not yet looking through the scope, but ready to transition from observation to engagement at Chen's signal, his body already settling into the shooting position that had become instinctive through practice and repetition. The fog lifted unevenly, clearing first from the valley floor where warming air rose through the cold fog layer, while remaining thicker on the surrounding slopes. It was just after 10 in the morning when Chen spoke quietly, his voice carrying the controlled excitement of someone who had found something significant but didn't want to disturb the kind of focused calm that accurate shooting required. A German officer had emerged from a command post positioned in a reinforced farmhouse approximately 800 yards distant, the building having been selected by German forces for the same reasons that made it obvious to experienced observers. It provided good sightlines of the surrounding area, while being substantial enough to offer protection from anything short of direct artillery hits. The officer wore the distinctive markings of a mid-level commander, probably a captain or major, based on the insignia Chen could distinguish through the binoculars, and he was consulting with two other figures who had followed him from the building's entrance. They appeared to be discussing something related to the map case one of them carried, likely conducting the kind of ground truthing that officers did when checking map information against actual terrain. It was exactly the kind of target that Monroe and Chen's assignment focused on, officers whose removal might disrupt German planning and coordination in ways that eliminating ordinary soldiers wouldn't. Monroe settled into his shooting position, controlling his breathing, letting his body find the stillness that accurate long-range shooting required. Through the modified scope, he could see the officers with remarkable clarity. The reading glass lens seemed to gather the morning light differently than the original optics had, creating an image that was somehow both softer and more defined. He made his minute adjustments for windage and elevation, noting the slight breeze moving through the valley, calculating the bullet's path across 800 yards of cold mountain air. Chen provided confirmation of range and environmental conditions, their partnership operating with the wordless efficiency that had developed over months of working together. Monroe's finger settled on the trigger, his breathing paused, and the rifle spoke with the sharp crack that echoed across the valley before fading into the surrounding mountains. Through the scope, Monroe saw the German officer collapse, the remaining figures immediately diving for cover. What made the moment significant wasn't just the successful engagement at extreme range, it was the clarity with which Monroe had been able to identify and track his target. The improvised scope had performed flawlessly, and in some ways better than the original equipment had. Over the next 2 weeks, Monroe engaged 17 targets at ranges between 600 and 850 yards, confirming 12 eliminations, with another 5 probable. His accuracy at extreme range began generating attention beyond his immediate unit. Other snipers in the division requested to examine his rifle, curious about the modification that seemed to be producing such consistent results. Word reached Major Frank Williams, the division's intelligence officer, who arrived at Monroe's position with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. Williams was a career officer who had initially opposed the formation of black combat divisions, but had developed grudging respect for the 92nd's actual performance, which contradicted much of what he had been taught to expect. Monroe demonstrated the scope's performance, and Williams spent an hour looking through it, comparing it to standard military optics, asking detailed questions about its construction. What started as a routine inspection became something approaching genuine interest, as Williams recognized that Monroe had potentially solved a problem that affected snipers throughout the army. Military scopes were precision instruments, but they were also fragile. Transport damage was common, and the supply chain for replacements was often slow, particularly for units operating in difficult terrain far from major supply depots. If a simple reading glass lens could create an effective field repair, that knowledge could prove valuable across the service. Williams arranged for Monroe to write up a detailed description of his modification, which was forwarded through channels to the Army's Ordnance Division. The report disappeared into military bureaucracy, and Monroe assumed nothing would come of it, just another case of a good idea being filed away and forgotten. What Monroe and Williams didn't know was that the report reached Captain Theodore Sampson, an ordnance officer who had been working on improving field repair capabilities for optical equipment. Sampson had been frustrated by the military's tendency to treat damaged optics as total losses requiring factory replacement, when he believed many could be field repaired if soldiers had proper guidance and simple materials. Sampson became intrigued by Monroe's modification, particularly by reports that it seemed to perform better than original equipment at extreme range. He requested permission to visit the 92nd's position, to examine the scope personally, and possibly conduct controlled testing. The request created minor confusion in the chain of command. It was unusual for an ordnance officer to take personal interest in a field modification, and some officers wondered if Sampson's real purpose was to reprimand Monroe for unauthorized equipment alteration. Captain Richardson, however, recognized the visit as a potential opportunity. and made sure Monroe's documentation was thorough and his equipment was available for inspection. Sampson arrived in mid-January, accompanied by a photographer and a technical sergeant who specialized in optical equipment. He spent 2 days at the 90 seconds position examining Monroe's scope, conducting test firings at various ranges, and documenting everything with the methodical attention of someone who understood he might be observing something significant. What emerged from Sampson's testing was unexpected. The reading glass lens modification wasn't just an adequate field repair, it actually offered certain advantages over the original military scope design. The simpler lens produced less chromatic aberration at extreme range. The reduced field of view actually helped some shooters maintain focus on target, and the modification was robust enough to withstand field conditions that might damage more complex optical systems. Sampson's report recommended that the Army develop an official field repair kit based on Monroe's innovation, including appropriate lenses and detailed instructions for soldiers needing to repair damaged scopes in situations where replacement wasn't immediately available. He specifically credited Staff Sergeant James Monroe by name and recommended his modification be studied for potential improvements to future scope designs. The recommendation created an interesting situation within the military bureaucracy. Here was a black soldier from a division many officers still viewed skeptically, whose improvised repair had potentially identified improvements applicable to equipment used throughout the Army. The report couldn't be easily dismissed because Sampson had documented everything thoroughly and had the technical credentials to speak authoritatively about optical systems. Monroe learned about the report's impact through Captain Richardson, who received a commendation from division headquarters, acknowledging Monroe's contribution to improving equipment reliability. The commendation was notably restrained in its language, carefully avoiding any suggestion that Monroe's innovation represented something exceptional, but Richardson assured Monroe that having his name in official reports as a positive contributor was itself significant for a black soldier in 1945. The practical impact took longer to manifest. By March, ordnance units began receiving field repair kits that included reading glass lenses of various strengths, detailed instructions for scope repair, and explicit authorization for soldiers to attempt field modifications when replacement wasn't feasible. The kits didn't credit Monroe by name that had been removed during revision, but soldiers who had heard the story knew where the innovation originated. Monroe's replacement scope finally arrived in late February, more than 2 months after it was requested. By that point, his improvised version had been in continuous use for 11 weeks, had survived transport across difficult terrain, and had functioned perfectly throughout temperature extremes and weather conditions that had damaged other equipment. Monroe kept the modified scope as a backup and began using the new military issue, but several times he found himself switching back to his own creation, particularly when conditions demanded the absolute best clarity at extreme range. The Vosges Mountain campaign concluded in March as German forces withdrew and Allied units advanced toward the German border. The 92nd Infantry Division's performance had been mixed, plagued by equipment shortages, inadequate support, and command decisions that reflected ongoing racial prejudices. Yet individual soldiers like Monroe had demonstrated capabilities that challenged the assumptions underlying their assignment to secondary sectors. Monroe's final tally for the campaign was 31 confirmed eliminations at ranges exceeding 600 yards, with another 16 probable eliminations where confirmation wasn't possible. His performance ranked among the highest in the division and compared favorably with snipers in any American unit during the same period. Yet his record remained largely unacknowledged outside his immediate command, filed away in reports that few would read and fewer would remember. What Monroe remembered most about the entire experience wasn't the shooting itself. Though the technical challenges interested him, it was the small moments of recognition that his improvisation had earned from people who would normally never notice a black soldier's contribution. Madame Arnaud refusing payment when he returned to her pharmacy to buy additional reading glasses as spares, telling him in broken English that soldiers who used their heads deserved support. Captain Sampson shaking his hand before departing and telling him that good ideas didn't care about the color of the person who had them. Chen laughing as they dismantled the scope for documentation, and saying that Monroe had just proved that sometimes the best engineering came from people who couldn't afford to wait for the perfect solution. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, and Monroe returned to Georgia in August. He found that the Army's recognition of his innovation meant nothing in a civilian world that still enforced rigid segregation. The skills he had developed, the problems he had solved, the recognition he had earned from officers who overcame their prejudices to acknowledge his capability, none of it translated into opportunities that his race didn't permit. He found work at a lumber mill, married his high school sweetheart, raised 4 children, and lived what appeared from the outside to be an unremarkable life. He rarely spoke about the war, partly because the questions he received usually focused on what it was like to serve in a segregated unit, rather than on what he had actually accomplished, and partly because he had learned that most people weren't really interested in hearing about a black man's contributions to a war they understood primarily through stories about white heroes. The reading glass scope modification became a footnote in military ordnance history, mentioned occasionally in technical manuals about field repairs, but rarely connected to the soldier who had invented it. The Army's official field repair kits continued to include reading glass lenses through the 1950s, but the origin story faded from institutional memory, simplified into generic advice about improvising with available materials. It wasn't until the 1990s, when a military historian researching the 92nd Infantry Division's equipment challenges discovered Captain Sampson's original report in archived ordnance records, that Monroe's contribution began receiving broader recognition. By that point, Monroe had been dead for 6 years, having passed away in 1988 without ever receiving public acknowledgement for his innovation. The historian Dr. Patricia Chen, David Chen's daughter who had grown up hearing her father's stories about his time as Monroe's spotter, made Monroe's story central to her dissertation on innovation and race in the World War II military. Her research documented not just the scope modification itself, but the broader context of how black soldiers' contributions were systematically minimized or erased from official histories even when their innovations were adopted service-wide. Dr. Chen's work led to Monroe's posthumous recognition by both military historians and civil rights organizations as an example of how talent and innovation persisted despite systemic discrimination. The reading glass scope became symbolic of something larger. The countless contributions made by people whose race, class, or status meant their innovations were either uncredited or attributed to others. Monroe's daughter, Ruth Monroe Washington, who had known little about her father's military service during his lifetime, found herself contacted by researchers, journalists, and military museums interested in preserving his story. She donated his personal effects, including the improvised scope he'd kept all those years, to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, where it became part of an exhibit on black military innovation. The scope sits in a climate-controlled case, its friction tape yellowed but intact, the 75-cent reading glass still in place after more than 70 years. The exhibit text explains the technical innovation, but also attempts to contextualize what it meant for a black soldier in a segregated army to have his field improvisation recognized even in the limited way Monroe's was. Visitors can look through a replica of the scope, comparing its view to that of standard military optics, seeing for themselves the clarity that Monroe discovered by necessity. What emerges from Monroe's story isn't a simple narrative of triumph over adversity, though elements of that exist. Instead, it's a more complex account of how innovation often comes from people working under constraints that more privileged individuals never face. Monroe couldn't simply requisition a new scope and wait for its arrival. His effectiveness, and potentially his survival, depended on solving the problem with whatever resources he could access. That pressure produced a solution that turned out to be better than the original equipment, a pattern that repeats throughout history when necessity meets skill and determination. The story also illuminates how institutional prejudice creates inefficiency, even by its own standards. The Army's racial policies were morally indefensible, but they were also practically stupid. They ensured that talented soldiers like Monroe were under-equipped, under-supported, and under-recognized, not because of capability, but because of ideology. When Monroe's innovation proved valuable enough that it couldn't be completely ignored, the military adopted the technique while minimizing the innovator's recognition, losing both the moral high ground and the practical benefit of encouraging more innovation from soldiers who might otherwise remain silent. Captain Richardson, who maintained correspondence with Monroe for years after the war, later wrote in his memoir that Monroe's scope modification taught him more about leadership than any military manual had. It showed him that talent appeared in places the system insisted it wouldn't, that necessity often produced better solutions than abundance, and that the Army's racial policies weren't just unjust but actively detrimental to military effectiveness. Richardson became a vocal advocate for military integration after the war, arguing that his time with the 92nd had proved that segregation weakened the service by refusing to utilize capable soldiers based on irrelevant criteria. The reading glass scope also became a teaching point in modern military training about field improvisation and the importance of empowering soldiers to solve problems creatively. While racial context isn't always emphasized in these settings, the core lesson that good ideas can come from any source and should be evaluated on merit, rather than origin, remains relevant. For the soldiers who served alongside Monroe, his improvisation represented something deeply personal. They had been assigned to a division that the Army's leadership clearly viewed as second-rate, equipped with whatever remained after white units had taken the best equipment, expected to perform adequately but not exceptionally. Monroe's modification, and more importantly his consistent performance using it, demonstrated that the shortage wasn't in capability but in support. Every time Monroe successfully engaged a target at extreme range using his 75-cent fix, it was a quiet refutation of the assumptions that had put them in a segregated unit in the first place. David Chen, Monroe's spotter, later told his children that watching Monroe work with that improvised scope taught him that excellence didn't require permission from people who doubted you. Monroe had simply done the best work he could with the resources available, not seeking approval or validation, just solving problems and performing his duty. That approach, Chen believed, was itself a form of resistance, refusing to let institutional prejudice define the limits of what was possible. The technical legacy of Monroe's innovation extended beyond World War II. Post-war scope development incorporated lessons learned from his modification, particularly regarding the benefits of simpler optical designs for certain applications. While modern military optics are far more sophisticated than anything available in 1944, the principle that simpler can sometimes be better for specific uses remained relevant in specialized applications. Military historians have noted that Monroe's story represents one of thousands of similar contributions made by black soldiers, sailors, and airmen during World War II, most of which went unrecorded or uncredited. The scope modification happened to be documented because it caught an ordnance officer's attention and proved replicable enough to warrant formal study. But for every innovation that made it into official reports, countless others simply disappeared, known only to the soldiers who witnessed them, and forgotten when those soldiers passed away without anyone thinking to record their stories. This pattern of erasure wasn't accidental. It reflected deliberate policies and cultural assumptions that treated black soldiers' contributions as anomalous rather than representative, as fortunate exceptions rather than evidence that capability had nothing to do with race. The scope modification couldn't be completely erased because it had been too thoroughly documented and had proved too useful. But even then, the military bureaucracy found ways to minimize the connection between the innovation and the innovator. What makes Monroe's story particularly valuable for contemporary audiences isn't just the technical innovation or even the historical record of segregation and discrimination. It's the demonstration of how talent persists regardless of circumstance. Monroe didn't have access to proper equipment, extensive resources, or institutional support. What he had was skill, determination, and a refusal to accept that problems couldn't be solved. That combination produced results that challenged the assumptions of people who believed they knew what soldiers like him were capable of. The 75-cent reading glass that Monroe bought from Madame Arnaud represented more than just an optical component. It symbolized the gap between what systems provide and what problems actually require. Monroe couldn't wait for the system to supply what he needed, so he found his own solution. That the solution proved superior to the original equipment was almost beside the point. What mattered was that necessity and skill had combined to produce functionality, where institutional processes had produced only delay. For Madame Arnaud, the French pharmacy owner who had survived occupation and liberation, Monro's visit represented one of countless small interactions through which ordinary people experienced the war. She probably never knew that the reading glass she sold became part of an officially documented military innovation. For her, it was simply another example of soldiers making do with whatever was available, the same improvisation she and her neighbors had practiced throughout years of hardship. That her 75-cent merchandise contributed to American military effectiveness in even a small way would likely have pleased her, though perhaps not surprised her, given how much of the war had been won through such accumulations of small adaptations. The Vosges Mountains, where Monro deployed his improvised scope, remain largely unchanged from their 1944 appearance, still covered in pine forests, still featuring the narrow valleys and steep ridges that made the sector ideal for patient marksmen. Occasionally, military history groups visit the area, walking the terrain where the 92nd Division operated, trying to understand the conditions these soldiers faced. Some know to look for the ridge where Monro and Chen established their observation post. Though no marker identifies the location, the mountains keep their secrets, indifferent to the stories of men who once fought across their slopes. What endures from Monro's experience isn't just the technical innovation or even the historical documentation of his service. It's the principle that capability appears wherever humans face challenges requiring solution. The military's racial policies assumed that black soldiers would be less capable, less innovative, less valuable than their white counterparts. Monro's 75-cent scope modification offered quiet refutation of those assumptions, proving that innovation came from the intersection of need and skill, regardless of the innovator's race. The larger question that Monro's story raises, and that remains relevant decades later, concerns how many other innovations, how many other solutions, how many other demonstrations of capability were lost because systems of discrimination prevented recognition or even documentation. For every James Monro whose story eventually surfaced through historical research, how many others simply vanished from record, their contributions known only to those who witnessed them and forgotten when those witnesses died? This question has no comfortable answer. It merely stands as reminder that history as we know it represents only what was documented and preserved, which in turn reflects who had power to document and what they considered worthy of preservation. Monro's story survived partly through accident, Captain Sampson's interest and thoroughness, partly through persistence, Dr. Chen's decades later research, and partly through evidence that couldn't be erased, the field repair kits that continued using reading glass lenses long after Monro's name had been forgotten. The reading glass scope now rests in museum climate control, no longer functional but preserved as artifact and symbol. Students, veterans, families, and casual visitors pause before it, reading the text explaining its significance, perhaps understanding something about how innovation emerges from constraint, how talent persists despite systematic discrimination, and how small objects can carry large meanings. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.